Viswa Colluru, welcome to The Deep End.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's great to chat with you. This is a really interesting episode. We're going to go to a bunch of topics that we haven't hit on the podcast before. Let's just start with an introduction. You've got a great background. You're working in the pharmaceutical space. You have a PhD. Introduce yourself to the listeners.
Yeah. My name is Viswa Colluru. I'm founder and CEO of Enveda Biosciences, and we translate nature into medicine.
That's a great intro because it sounds interesting, but I don't know what that means.
Yeah.
Let's go one step deeper then into the deep end. What does it mean to translate nature into medicine?
Yeah. So by translating nature into medicine, here's what I mean. Nature actually represents the most validated yet untapped idea in the pharmaceutical industry. Between a third and a half of all small molecules, which means medicines that we take in pill form, actually owe their origin to a molecule that was first once discovered in nature. Yet today, our estimates are that between 95 and 99.9% of nature is a chemical mystery, which means we do not know the molecules that are in us, on us, or around us. And what we're doing today is taking that very old idea, which has worked extremely well, and building the technology to integrate it back into modern drug discovery workflows to address what I think is the key bottleneck in drug discovery, which is that things that work in the lab don't work in people. Today, only 1 in 10 drugs, after years and millions of dollars of investment, actually works in human trials to deliver a new approved medicine that the FDA signs off on.
So just to give the audience a good picture here, what's like the peak example you could think of a naturally occurring phenomenon that's translated into impactful improvement of our medical lives?
Yeah. Have you heard of the medicine aspirin? So aspirin comes from a molecule that was originally discovered in the willow bark. I think now nearly 300 years ago, 200 or 300 years ago, and 1 in 3 Americans will take an aspirin every day, right? And aspirin comes from a compound called salicylic acid, and it is a variation of that molecule. And salicylic acid is a naturally occurring molecule. I think aspirin is the largest selling drug in terms of lives touched. But of course, we have many more examples. Metformin comes from a plant called goat's rue and is used by 500 million diabetics world over. Morphine, which is the first medicine to have been sold in a bottle, is still the mainstay for millions of Americans that have severe acute or chronic pain, comes from the poppy seed, and I could go on and on and on. Like quinine, for example, I love that particular one because the story of quinine and battles of getting the extract of the cinchona bark, which is where it's derived from, preceded colonial battles because historically when colonial powers tried to occupy tropical regions, their soldiers would succumb to malaria. And then they realized that this, golden extract of the cinchona bark had anti-malarial properties. At that time, they didn't know it was malaria, but they knew that that's what they needed to take in order to fight off the fever. So there were proxy battles, and you can say this natural product has shaped more than, of course, anti-malarial treatments to save millions of lives, but maybe even global geopolitics going back a couple hundred years ago.
That's fascinating. I guess the obvious question is, we really enjoy walking through the idea maze to keep our metaphors straight with founders as they actually speak about their ideas. And I think the idea of drug discovery, nature, medicine, those are very exciting, very interesting. How did you first get involved in the space?
Yeah.
And then what made you desire to translate from just participating in the pharmaceutical space to actually founding and building a company?
Yeah. Since you nudge me to give you more details, I'm going to go way deep on the deep end this time and start at the beginning. Yeah. So I was born and raised in South India, and in like any good middle-class South Indian boy, I wanted to study computer science and work in Silicon Valley, right? So today's makeup of Silicon Valley is actually not an accident. It very much was a societal construct. However, I ended up studying biology after I lost my mother to leukemia and realized that over 95% of diseases do not have an approved treatment. So found my way from sunny South India to sunny Madison, Wisconsin. in order to pursue a little known field called immunotherapy, right? The fact that my mother's cancer kept coming back made me ask some pretty fundamental questions as I think an ignorant high schooler, and ask, why is it that cancers do come back? And the answer I received was, well, you never really get rid of the last cancer cell, so you need a treatment that works at cellular precision. And that's what drove me to immunotherapy, which in 2010, 2011 was actually not mainstay. Today, there's a Nobel Prize. It remains the mainstay for multiple kinds of cancer and has really turned the tides on how we can treat cancer, but it wasn't back then. And by the time I graduated, of course, there were a couple of clinical trials, and it went from being a field that no one believed in to a field that very much earmarked the future of cancer care. And I realized that it's a lot of fun being at the edge of an idea when the tides turn on it. But I also realized that there's two main things that probably would help us pick out such ideas. One is my contrarian take on where innovation comes from, right? We tend to think of innovation as something new that we've never heard of, like cell and gene therapy, for example, right? However, even those ideas, as well as many that are changing our lives today, have actually been posited and tried in the past and failed. One of my favorite authors and thinkers on innovation, Safi Bahcall, says that every good idea has to die 3 times. Right? So immunotherapy has at least died 3 times before it changed cancer care. Digital cameras, electric cars, neural networks, you name it. And so I said, what is an idea that no one believes in just because it didn't work in the past? And the second criteria to pick out these ideas were, you should be able to explain it to a 5-year-old, and it must make sense, right? And the 5-year-old explanation for immunotherapy is your tumors have a high mutation rate. They have new genes that make new proteins that are recognized by your immune system, much like your immune system would recognize a virus and fight it off. Great, makes sense. So for me, that was the defining moment as I reflected on my PhD journey and realized, okay, let me look for the next big idea that satisfies these 2 criteria, right? Navigating the idea maze. And at that time, it very much was this confluence of machine learning with the data science and all of the data explosion that was happening in biology because of new analytical methods. And I found my way to Salt Lake City, Utah, from Madison, Wisconsin, to work at a little-known company at that time called Recursion Pharmaceuticals. Recursion, of course, is now one of the leaders in this space. It's a unicorn. It's a public stage company. But I happened to join, in the first 25 employees and see a startup being built from the ground up, as well as a new playbook for tech bio being written. After 3 impactful years building and leading multiple teams and functions, I realized that the fundamental problem in drug discovery is one that I've already mentioned once before, and one that I'll probably mention later, is that things that work in the lab don't work in people, right? And Recursion was doing tremendous work reimagining biological relationships using embeddings derived from microscopy images that computers look at rather than people. I said, great, let me turn this problem upside down and ask, what are medicines such that if we do work on them, take them into clinical investigation, and they work, people are not going to be surprised. And that led me to, well, this was the very origin of the pharmaceutical industry. There's hundreds, if not thousands of other sources of medicines that we could go after. Why haven't we gone after them? And I'll cut a very long story short, but I discovered the startling fact, which was the second part of my introduction, which is that a vast majority of nature's chemical code remains uncharacterized. We sequence the genomes of everything we can touch, but the chemistry behind life is actually largely a mystery. So when I discovered an opportunity to work on, another problem that met those 2 criteria, which is, hey, people don't do this anymore because they stopped in the 90s when they couldn't find drugs from natural sources fast enough because they didn't know what is in it. However, it makes sense to a 5-year-old because every compound that is made by nature is the result of billions of years of convergent evolution, where these molecules are made by a protein and made for a protein. So I said, hey, what if we revisited this idea that was very successful, then ran out of steam because, we didn't have the technology to really look inside nature, but revisit it now because there's both validation and, seemingly endless opportunity. That was the idea maze, and that's how I got there. The next question you'll probably ask is, well, how did you decide to do it? Frankly, I never thought I would be an entrepreneur. I grew up and I was actually kind of a type A person that took everything, really seriously. In my PhD, I learned a big lesson about dealing with uncertainty. And so if you had asked me 10 years ago, hey, you'll actually be running a company where almost everything is unknown, I would have definitely not been your friend, right? And then when I said, hey, this idea is so impactful, is aligned with my principles in many ways, looking back, it looks like I had been journeying my entire life to earn these secrets, in the words of Mark Andreessen, and actually be at this point in life. I almost felt that it was a responsibility to catalyze the vision, be able to sell that idea to folks, and actually see if we could put structure and function, so what is a molecule and what does it do, on the chemical code for all of life.
You actually did not anticipate correctly, because I had a million other questions other than why did you start a company, because it seemed to me in your answer there was so many things to unpack here. So let's just start in no particular order, especially we're working with the explaining this to a 5-year-old concept. So number one, when we're talking about nature, natural, like what balance in the drug discovery / invention process is natural versus quote unquote unnatural?
Yeah. So right now, funnily enough, I would say that 99% of drug discovery, the way it's being done today, and it's easy to abstract away that problem, but I'm going to ground it in some reality and say, well, every medicine that could come for every disease, for every loved one right, that may have a disease, comes from a pool of about 3 to 5 million synthetic compounds that chemists have made in the lab, right? And today, no pharmaceutical industry actually is using nature's chemistry and the hundreds of millions of molecules that have spent trillions of experiments over billions of years in evolution to try and find answers to disease. And this is largely because these molecules occur in mixtures of unknowns. So the way that I think about it is the entire industry is looking for all possible medicines that could come in the future within a cup of water in the ocean of chemistry. What do I mean? There's over 10 to the power 60, so that's 10 followed by 60 zeros, of possible chemicals in the universe. And 5 million is just like a cup of water in an ocean, right? And so you might then say, well, what is the best way to explore the ocean of chemistry? And that brings me back again to a core belief that we have at Enveda, is that time and evolution have actually identified the set of molecules that are most likely to be active in this domain of carbonaceous life and actually deliver, substrate that we can use to discover new medicines. So the short answer is none at all, 100% at Enveda, and we're going to change how the industry thinks about using this treasure trove of natural chemistry.
Speaking of industry, when you were describing your first role in working in the industry, you talked about how there's a playbook for building unicorns in this space. Like within reason, can you kind of articulate what that looks like? So if you're a PhD, a product manager at one of these companies, like what would you be looking at a basic, top-down level for understanding what playbook for success looks like?
Yeah. I would say that one, the playbook is still being written, so I don't have any definitive answers. Hopefully Enveda writes a chapter in it. Two, the playbook has evolved. So initially, the assumption was that if you can explain a compelling thesis and then validate a technology to make that thesis come to life and be able to sell this package, then you should be able to convince the pharmaceutical industry, right, or the life sciences industry at large, that you have something of value that they can bet their money on. However, what the mistake that I think everyone made is when the industry would be willing to bet its money on it, right? If you go back to the core thing I said, things that work in the lab don't work in people. So today you have an industry that is extremely risk averse, that is sitting on a de-risking profile that's highly bimodal. So anything that's in the lab, doesn't matter if it's created by AI or extremely persuasive technology, they still won't believe it until, 100 patients, depending on the disease, right? But several patients actually take that pill or take that injection and notice a benefit relative to a placebo, right? And so that is typically how the industry thinks about it. So what does this mean for the playbook? It's not enough to have a really good, compelling thesis like, hey, there's drugs in nature, clearly, because half of them come from there. And there's lots of opportunity in nature because 99% of nature is unknown. It's not enough to have a technology to say, hey, we've built a search engine for new drugs that can look at any molecule in nature and answer the question of what the molecule is and what it does. That's still incomplete. Today, the playbook as it stands, especially in a bear market in biotech, is one such that you need the thesis, the technology, but you also need product, which means that you need to put your own money where your mouth is and actually show that you can discover new molecules that have an outsized chance of working in people and beating the industry's batting average. So very much the playbook today is vertically integrated companies that where their technology is anchored in product value. And I think similar themes have emerged in synthetic biology, for example, or diagnostics. It's not enough to have a large amount of data and a tech that can analyze it. Let's reduce it to practice and create value for stakeholders, patients, and society.
I want to unpack your use of the term/phrase bear market in biotechnology, because to your point, when you're explaining how the industry works, you were saying that it already was risk averse.
Yeah.
So what does a bear market mean in an inherently risk averse industry in the first place?
Yeah. So I'll actually answer the risk averse part because I think something that is very intrinsically linked is like, how does the industry innovate? Right? Mm-hmm. And the risk aversion and the way that the industry is set up is one that actually makes it pretty interesting to innovate in for the simple reason that the efficient market hypothesis isn't true for biotech and pharma. And that's because of three things, right? There's high barriers to entry.
Could you explain what the efficient market hypothesis is first?
Absolutely. The efficient market hypothesis goes something like, hey, every good idea there is that is obvious has been tried. And or if there's untapped value in the market, an efficient market will recognize it in short order and equilibrate the value, right? So everybody recognizes it and kind of equilibrates supply and demand. However, in going back to the idea definition of an efficient market, if there's a good idea, has it been tried and actually been evaluated such that there's a market value for it? Probably true in, high frequency trading of stocks, but definitely not true in hypothesis generation of small molecule or biologic medicines. For the simple reason that there's high barriers to entry, there's high barriers to progress, and high barriers to success. You used to need a PhD, a long career, a deep network in Boston to get started. And I think we've broken down a lot of those barriers where if you're a highly technical founder that makes sense, there's a big generalist pool of investors that is willing to make the bet. There's barriers to progress because it's not trivial to be able to set up, and then use the infrastructure. Like you need a lab, you need an animal house, you need, new algorithms, you need your data sets to ultimately create a hypothesis. Then that hypothesis is typically either a biological hypothesis where you say, I actually know what protein to hit, or it's a chemical hypothesis where you say, I have a molecule that I think will be a medicine. You have to test it, and you have to prove to the agency that you're more likely to cause benefit than harm and that this molecule is really safe. And then the barriers to success come in where you're like, okay, great, I now did all of this work. Now I have to execute what are really complex, operations that involve multiple agencies and regulatory oversight in order to conduct a trial, choose the right indications, choose the right endpoint, get your group size or get the statistics of your clinical trial right in order to generate the evidence. So what this means is that there are many good ideas that are actually sitting for people to come in and work on because people aren't willing to believe in just a good idea, right? And this context and background is very essential as we talk about a bear market, which was your original question. And what it means in a bear market is actually pretty simple, is people are less likely to bet on potential than they are on realized value. And realized value in biotech means you actually have a molecule or a gene therapy or a biologic that you can own that is on its way to becoming a product. The one advantage we tend to have in biotech is that there's very low commercial or market risk, right? If you can get a molecule as a startup to show benefit in a patient population that doesn't have as good options as your candidate, you have probably generated hundreds of millions of dollars in value. So that's what it means for a biotech bear market. And of course, humans being humans, what it has led to today, as we are sitting in May 2023, is people are willing to make more bets early on because they're hoping the market turns by the time those companies mature. But it's becoming pretty hard to get through what I would call the typical growth stage of a biotech company. In that context, I'd say we're extremely lucky at Enveda to have a very strong cap table and have recently closed $119 million in Series B funding that'll take us into the clinic.
Congrats. And can you actually explain what the funding model for a biotech company looks like in the first place? So like angels, Series A, you've got your seed round, your B, like how does that process technically usually work? Not less the amounts and more just sort of like, do you need to show up with like a pitch deck? Like what's the actual because to your point, there's actual discovery. What does that look like?
Yeah, and I will actually demarcate between the historical biotech funding model and one that has emerged, I think, with the tech bio movement. And there's many definitions and aspects of the tech bio movement that we can go into. But the traditional model historically has been, there's a handful of firms that are very, very savvy and are very well versed with building a biotech company in order to sell the thesis and technology or ultimately sell assets that are pretty early in clinical development to large pharma. And in order to basically be a part of this biotech movement, you needed to have had a lot of experience under your belt, done this before, have a thesis that is pretty palatable to pharma because they were the ultimate customer and the customer was kept in mind at the very beginning. But these were basically largely venture studios. So they were venture capital firms that owned the cap table, that prioritized ideas, that brought together talent and technology from academia, their internal, Rolodex of executives, and started it. In this case, you got founder shares that were 1% to 5%, and so did, the academic founders and everybody else, and they were tranched rounds, which means you start off, the firm commits 30, 50, 70, 80 million, but it's given to you over a series of milestones that de-risk your thesis, your technology, and ultimately the products. So this was a movement, I think, that largely sustained biotech R&D pipelines. I would say in the last 10 years, there's been a rise of understanding what technology and artificial intelligence perhaps could bring to how we think about biotech and early stage drug discovery that has simultaneously led to tech and generalist investors being interested. It has led to the birth of a new kind of founder, perhaps more that look like me. So younger in their career, have a thesis, and that is perhaps not that palatable to pharma, but perhaps is more like your prototypical tech founder, right? And today, for the tech bio, I would say there's a wide spectrum of what a seed and a Series A looks like. But what you really need to align with your investors on is what kind of company are you? Are you going to be a solutions company? Are you going to ultimately, plan on selling your assets pretty early? Are you going to have internal pipelines at all? Or are you going to be pretty much a discovery partner with multiple different pharmas? So have a business model, have a thesis that makes sense, have aligned milestones, and raise the money that'll get you to your next milestones and value inflection point with a little bit of wiggle room to spare, and then keep moving forward. So that is how we built Enveda, starting from actually a 1 million pre-seed that Village Global was a part of.
And the obvious question here then is, you use the magic letters AI, artificial intelligence, that's the very hot thing. How does AI play into biotechnology and specifically your company?
Yeah. Artificial intelligence has been around for a long time, as I've mentioned, only recently come of age because of the explosion of data, the explosion of compute power. But ultimately, the reason that happened is because AI is largely going to help us unlock biological and chemical data interpretation. What does that mean, right? It means that when you have data of sufficient precision, quality, relevance, and quantity, you can actually use it to generate insight into what that data actually means. A great example for it is the AlphaFold from Google. They trained on three-dimensional protein structure and said, actually, we can look at amino acid sequences, which is what make up a protein, and predict how they fold. And what they did is, by doing this and getting the accuracy to such a point, they have democratized the ability of biological labs or students or anyone with a computer to predict the shape of a protein and, as a result, what it might do. And I think that's a great example of artificial intelligence, where there's a specific problem where there's high quality data, and interpretation of that data allows you to shortcut lengthy experimentation cycles in the lab. Very similar to AlphaFold, what Enveda does is actually predict the two-dimensional shape of a chemical, right? Instead of using amino acid sequences, we use a technology called mass spectrometry that essentially is a fancy way of saying you take a molecule in an ionized chamber, you hit it with radiation, you break it into fragments. Now you have a bag of fragments, and we use artificial intelligence to actually read the sequence of those fragments to predict the two-dimensional shape of a molecule. So essentially, we've built the AlphaFold for chemistry. And such kind of data interpretation problems, especially in what I like to call the micro realm of the world, which is like biology, chemistry, and physics, I think AI has already shown it can lead to a sea change in how we think about drug discovery. For example, AlphaFold now allows us to virtually screen billions of molecules against proteins without doing lengthy experimentations to realize what that protein does. Enveda's platform allows us to search the hundreds of millions of molecules in nature to look for molecules that we believe one day will have the chance to become a medicine, right? And prioritize the molecule, prioritize the salicylic acid that will give you the aspirin. And I think this is beyond, I would say at this point, controversy. That this is a step function change in how AI will enable molecular data interpretation. What I'm really curious of is like, how much will the generative aspect of it, though we use generative AI for discovery of new chemistry, how much will, for example, inventing new chemicals or inventing new proteins actually work, right? For example, when you invent a new chemical, it's not enough for an AI to dream up something. that chemical has to be synthesizable in the lab for us to turn it into a tangible product. So that, I think, is a rapidly evolving field that I'm actually very, very excited to see where it goes. So all of this is in the micro realm, but ultimately, I think we need to always step back and ask, what is it about my thesis that AI can enable such that we can actually hold a belief that the molecules that we discover have a better chance of working in people and not just in the lab. So to that extent, I think AI can provide an accelerant in multiple steps.
In this last section, I want to kind of zoom out a bit and focus on more of the meta things. I've interviewed a decent number of PhDs who are founders, CEOs, co-founders, et cetera. You, in between your PhD and founding this company, obviously worked as a product manager.
Yep.
I'm curious, do you think that intermediary step was necessary? So let's pretend, because obviously you're working in scientific development here and with biotech, so it's not as if maybe the opportunity you're pursuing now wasn't available in 2009.
Right.
But do you think that, let's say you were completing your PhD now, would it have been possible for you to jump straight into company building, or did you need the intermediary space?
I think, is it possible? Absolutely. Would I have done it any other way? No. I think that the nearly 3 years that I spent in a hyperscale biotech startup was very, very essential at two levels. One is for me to build models and earn secrets about the industry, right? What is the industry's biases, their privileges, and their prejudices, and learning how the industry ticks, and building the skills necessary to operate in that industry. So being able to put the hat of someone that can do clinical development, commercial development, or R&D. I think today there are people far smarter than myself at the company, but at least I acquired the ability to ask them the right questions, right? So that was at my level. At the level of company, I think we have the tremendous advantage of learning from the first generation of companies that have kind of attempted to write this playbook and say, okay, what are things that worked? What are things that didn't work? So in many ways at Enveda, we're able to shortcut to the playbook that I said is the gold standard today. And for both those reasons, I think I would not have given up those 3 years to get a head start. And even if I did, we wouldn't have come as far as we did in the 4 years at Enveda as we have today.
Another thing I want to go back to is just that opening idea around innovation requiring 3 different failures. That's really fascinating. Can you just kind of unpack that a bit? Because as I'm thinking about it, there are probably different levels of failure. I'm engaging with the idea for the first time, so stop me if I get this incorrect, but there's business model failure, there's just pure underlying viability. So for example, we've had electric cars since the invention of the car. Actually, I think the first cars were electric. The issue was the business model, how you actually implemented it. So can you just unpack this idea? Because I think this is an idea that could apply to basically anyone building in any product, even outside of biotech, obviously.
Yeah. I think you hit the nail on its head. And to say, what are ideas that make sense that perhaps have left a delta or alpha of unfulfilled potential, and dig into why they didn't work, right? And I'll give you 2 examples, one, both that I'm intricately familiar with and spend a lot of time thinking about in the biological and drug discovery realm. One is immunotherapy. So there was a surgeon in the 1890s in New York that said, hey, what if I take this juice of bacteria and inject it in people's cancers, right? And if I do that, maybe what will happen is the same system that fights the bacteria, fights the cancer, mistakes the cancer for being, bacterial, and actually delivers cures. Turns out that in some patients, he saw remarkable cures. Then, over the next 100 years, the idea fell in and out of fancy. But one of the big reasons why it fell out of fancy was some work in the 1950s that showed that the immune system had nothing to do with cancer by generating mice that didn't have an immune system. However, turns out that those mice actually did have an immune system. Folks didn't have the way to detect the cells that leaked through And as a result, the mice that they thought were immune compromised actually had an immune system, and as a result, their conclusions were invalid. It took until 2000s, I think probably around 2007, when some amazing work started coming out, showing that no, in fact, the immune system has huge implications on whether or not you get cancer and how bad the cancer is. So here is an idea that existed, that died, that was resurrected, but understanding why something failed, I think, will allow you to say, okay, is there something different about how I would apply and scale the idea, or the world as it is today that would make me relook at what is an obvious thing that a 5-year-old would try. And we can go down a very similar story with natural products. The origin of the pharmaceutical industry, we discovered aspirin, warfarin, quinine, metformin, morphine, all of these medicines. Then it became actually really hard for people to, as the world shifted towards a model of disease that involved sequencing the genome, identifying a single protein, and using that to treat disease, to say, well, I no longer want a mixture of 10,000 molecules that I can extract from a plant. I want a single compound. And so they threw all those libraries out. And today, when we're sitting, when I was sitting in 2019, I looked back and said, well, this idea failed not because this chemistry was not useful, but because it was hard to pull out the useful parts of that chemistry. And what if we could build, a machine learning enabled search engine to exactly pull those molecules out? I didn't know we would end up building the AlphaFold for chemistry, but that's what it ended up being. And today, we're able to integrate the most high potential chemistry into modern drug discovery. And at Enveda, we achieve, success rates in the laboratory that are about 10 times greater than the industry average in finding molecules and advancing them all the way to where they treat disease in multiple animal models.
So I guess what's the next? So if you've hit that data point, you've hit this level of thesis validation. What's the next step for you all?
The next step for us,
Series B, all that.
Yeah, for us is always get closer to the patient, right? As I mentioned, thesis and technology are still 2/3 of the playbook. Is to live out and execute on the next 1/3, which is to drive as many of our molecules into patients and overcome that barrier of success demonstration, if you will, and show that our thesis and our tech actually delivers medicines that at a rate and efficiency that hasn't been seen before. So we're hyper-focused on taking our most advanced molecules, which address, suffering of hundreds of millions of patients and will address suffering of hundreds of millions of patients as we get to approval and beyond, to treat conditions like itch, pain without addiction, inflammatory bowel disease, a whole host of inflammatory skin diseases, and lung fibrosis, things that today are in need of treatments where patients actually have superior quality of life compared to what the industry has to offer.
I think the last big question, this is the On Deck podcast. You participated in ODF3. It'd be great to just sort of close for listeners who are interested in On Deck, the work we're doing, who are interested in these topics. How was your experience? All that good stuff.
Yeah. So I think I was in ODF3, which was fully virtual with some events in person. It also happened to be, I think, particularly in sync with the pandemic. So it was perfect that it was virtual. But the On Deck community helped me with connecting with people that were on a similar journey. And that, as a founder, it can be pretty lonely as you're going through, the motions of building a company, and you're largely faced with rejection every day. So the people were an exceptional part. I'd say maybe the second P was playbooks. Since there were people working in different domains at perhaps in different points in their journey, everyone was incredibly open about, hey, here's the playbook for building a cap table. Here's the playbook for raising a pre-seed round. Here's the playbook for finding a co-founder. I think those playbooks were incredibly useful and put Enveda, I think, on a supercharged track. Last but not the least, I think the community aspect of it. And this is somewhat different from being able to connect to other founders, but being part of a movement that had a larger than itself purpose in order to democratize learning and building and creating value in the world, believing that nothing was impossible. So the third P perhaps is the purpose that I found was incredibly useful.
I will say the ability to bring 3 different P's into it is incredibly impressive. Viswa, this has been really great. I guess the closing question would be, what fascinates about interviewing you is you clearly know what you're talking about. You really dove into this space. This podcast we're doing is part of a broader series into like addressing big problems through startups, innovation in this category. You're focused on drug discovery. Do you have any industry or category agnostic advice you'd have for prospective founders who say, hey, I see this problem, I want to fix it, I want to learn about it? Obviously, years required you getting a PhD and working in the industry. Would you say that applies to a lot of these, like, let's say, this isn't B2B SaaS, right?
Right.
So how would you just close that?
Yeah, I would say that, some of the things that I learned about building is to have just an insane bias towards action, and to move forward in spite and despite uncertainty, right? So at any time in building a company, you will only know perhaps the next couple of steps. You'll never see the full staircase because of too many variables that you can't predict. So the one thing perhaps, and the most important of the lessons, is just do it, right? And I don't want to bastardize Nike's slogan, but I think my number one advice is do it. And this is because you'll never know enough. It's always going to feel scary, but if you just take that step, you'll learn more about yourself, the world, and your product, and it'll become a little bit clearer. Why just do it? 1, because it's perhaps the fastest way you can grow. And 2, when I was paralyzed in fear for giving up my insurance, giving up my job, right, facing some childhood traumas, and actually starting a company, my sister told me this, and she said, life rewards you for what you do, not what you know, right? And so go ahead and do stuff, because that's the best way to know more and actually put what you know to good use. So that would be my industry agnostic advice to starting a company and getting started on the path to entrepreneurship.
That is a honestly deeply inspiring and great way to end this podcast. I could personally think of a million different ways I could implement the just do it, obviously citing Nike advice. Thank you so much for joining me on The Deep End.
Thank you so much for having me.